Welcome everyone and thanks for joining our seminar series. My name is Roberta Comunian and I'm a professor of creative economies at King's College London, and I will be hosting this seminar for you. This is the fifth seminar of our series Recrea, Researching Creative Economies in Africa, Sharing Knowledge, Methods and Practice, and this is a collaborative project between King's College London, Aarhus University and Humboldt University of Berlin. It aims to bring together current research from a range of disciplines that explore the value, workings and impact of creative economies in Africa. The seminar series is funded and supported by Circle U Seed funding. I'm pleased to introduce you our speaker. Joining us from Nairobi is Dr. Kathrin Schmidt. She's a cultural and creative sector consultant, researcher and writer, and a member of the UNESCO Culture 2030 Indicators Experts Facility. Today, Kathrin will talk with us about research emerging from her published PhD work on globalization, commodification, and cultural production in Africa, contemporary theatre in Sierra Leone. Thanks, Kathrin, for sharing your work with us. I'll leave you the floor.
Today's seminar, Globalization, Commodification and Cultural Production in Africa, Contemporary Theatre in Sierra Leone, is based on my PhD research and the book I published as a result of this research. But before starting my presentation, I just want to briefly introduce myself and also explain a little bit how this research came about. As a cultural and creative sectors consultant, researcher and writer, I work on strategy, policy, research and evaluation projects in the arts, heritage and creative sectors, with a particular focus on cultural cooperation and culture and development programs, cultural policy and strategies, sector development, program design, evaluations, as well as mapping and impact studies. And I have lived in Kenya now for nearly 10 years, and since then, most of my work has focused on various African countries and cultural relations between Africa and Europe in particular. But before moving to Kenya, I also lived and worked in Sierra Leone, and my PhD research on the political economy of cultural and creative industries in West Africa was inspired by the experiences that I had while living and working in Sierra Leone. And so in today's seminar, I just want to give a brief introduction to my research. Then I'll describe the context for cultural production in Sierra Leone briefly before highlighting the key aspects of my research approach. And then I'll move on to presenting the key findings of my research in terms of the micro level of cultural production in Sierra Leone. Then I'll present the key findings in terms of the macro level before ending my presentation with some final reflections. So as I just said before, today's seminar is based on my PhD research and the book I published as a result of this research. And it focuses on contemporary Sierra Leonean theatre and the political economy of its aesthetics and ecology, especially within the context of local and global flows of people, media, images, technologies, finance, and ideas. And so combining the analysis of theatre and its aesthetics with its policy, structural, and institutional context, my research really sought to highlight the interconnectedness and the relationships between the micro and the macro levels of cultural production, between the local and the global, and between aesthetics, politics, policy, governance structures, institutions, and history. And so moving beyond aesthetics and theatre as an art form, my research really shows how theatre and its wider ecology, including cultural policymaking, are influenced and shaped by the international development industry, international cultural organizations, and international cultural relations. And so as such, the book also really links particular findings within the context of Sierra Leone to larger issues of contemporary local cultural production in relation to globalization, commodification, the so-called global creative economy, culture and sustainable development, international relations, and decolonisation. I'd like to begin my presentation with a quote by one of my interviewees, because this quote really encapsulates the main issue that Sierra Leonean theatre has faced since the 1990s. And so this person said to me, people say to me, you used to write very good plays, why are you not anymore? And I say, it's not a good business financially. Even if you don't make any profit, if you break even, that's good. But if you put your money down the hole, it doesn't matter how much you love theatre, it just won't work. And as I said, I chose this quote because it really encapsulates the main issues that Sierra Leonean theatre is facing since the 1990s. And to give you a bit more understanding of the context for cultural production in Sierra Leone, I just also want to give a quick overview of the history of Sierra Leonean theatre since the country's independence from the United Kingdom in 1961. So between the 1960s and 1980s, Sierra Leone had a very vibrant theatre scene, but it experienced a steady decline in the 1990s due to political and economic instability, mass immigration, the lack of venues, the country's civil war between 1991 and 2002, and the growing popularity of other art forms and media, such as music and film. Despite constant progress since the end of the civil war in 2002, Sierra Leone remains one of the most fragile and poorest countries in the world, with many competing demands on public and personal resources. And like in other sectors, institutions, governance structures, and resources within Sierra Leone's cultural and creative industries were left extremely fragile after the war and were further affected by the country's health and economic crises following the Ebola epidemic between 2014 and 2016, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result of this reduced space for theatre in the cultural ecology of Sierra Leone since the 1990s, as well as a result of the multi-layered consequences of the civil war, competing financial priorities, and the influx of international aid money since the end of the war, theatre has more easily become recruited by the development industry and its development goals, agendas, and strategies. So developmental theatre now dominates the current theatre scene in Sierra Leone, and existing theatre practices, and I would say generally artistic freedom, are circumscribed by the imposition of this present developmental agenda and by funders who prescribe narratives in relation to their own programs and strategies, selling theatre as infotainment. And so these dynamics led to the dominance of a kind of theatre that is instrumentalized by both national and international NGOs and development agencies, sometimes also by the government, to spread certain messages and information, for example, about health, women's and children's rights, or free elections. And while I was working in Sierra Leone in 2010 and 2011 with one of the longest standing theatre companies in the country called the Freetown Players International, I just became more and more curious about what exactly happened, which factors contributed to the decline of the sector, and what may be needed to strengthen it again. And so my professional and personal experiences in Sierra Leone and the questions that I began to ask myself during this time about artistic freedom, aesthetic choices, and the impact of globalization and international organizations then led to this research and its main research question, which was, how does the continuum of local and global flows, in particular within the context of contemporary globalization, commodification, and hegemonic systems, impact both theatre aesthetics and the policy, structural, and institutional context for theatre production in Sierra Leone? I'd like to now also share a bit more about my approach to this research, because quite quickly I realized that my initial questions on aesthetics and artistic choices needed to be examined from a more holistic perspective and could not be separated from an understanding of the wider ecology within which these artistic expressions emerge. And so I found the notion of the ecology of culture very useful, as it also directs attention to the relationships and patterns that shape cultural production. And so in the context of my research, the flows that I analyze refer to both the local and the global flows of people, media, images, technologies, finance, and ideas, based on, of course, Upper Dry's notion of the 5 dimensions of global cultural flows. the ethnoscapes, technoscapes, ideoscapes, financescapes, and mediascapes. But in order to understand the impact of these flows from a very specific local perspective, it was necessary to not only examine these flows in terms of global phenomena and in terms of the translation and transformation of global flows in a specific location, it was necessary to also analyze the flows within the locality of Sierra Leone and the context of wider local cultural, political, economic, and social dynamics. And so I conceived of the flows affecting cultural production as a continuum of local and global processes, which also questions the dichotomy and the fixed notions of the local and the global. Of course, my main research question is connected to several additional interlinked sub-questions which examine the complex nature of these flows and their impact. So questions concerning, for example, roles and responsibilities within the sector, power relations and decision-making processes, historical legacies, structures, and the effects of all these flows. And so this really required a very interdisciplinary approach. And I also found the political economy perspective a very useful analytical lens. Analyzing cultural production from a political economy perspective requires a historicizing and holistic approach. And so this really means analyzing cultural production as historically, politically, culturally, socially, and economically situated. And in turn, this also involves then the need to understand the relationships and interconnectedness between individuals, institutions, governments, and public policies that constitute the production, distribution, consumption, and regulation of cultural production. So in summary, my research focuses on two different but very interlinked aspects. So firstly, the impact of historical, cultural, political, economic, and social factors on current theatre aesthetics in Sierra Leone, what I call the micro level. And then secondly, the influence of these factors on the structural, institutional, and policy context for Sierra Leonean theatre and the cultural and creative industries more broadly, what I call the macro level. But before talking more about theatre and the cultural and creative industries in Sierra Leone, I'd like to show a brief video about Freetown, so the capital of Sierra Leone, that also features some artists and creatives to give you a bit of an idea about the context that I'm talking about. And this video was produced as part of a collaboration project between Freetown and Hull, funded by Hull UK City of Culture in 2017.
A place cannot produce poems. It can only not prevent them. And Freetown is good at that, for Freetown has its own sudden elegances. People are slow to leave it, quick to return. And there are others who come for a year or two and stay for a lifetime, sensing that they found a city that is in the world, yet sufficiently on the edge of it to have a different resonance. Let me tell you something about this city. All of us, we're all just passing through, and we've all been here forever. Those who came, those who stayed, those who never returned. Tides turn, seasons change. We've waited and we've watched. But we've always been here. We've always listened. Because there is a different resonance here. It comes from the river, and the land, and the sky.
It's our place. All of us.
This city belongs to everyone.
And you know when it's your time.
And it's our time.
Listen, we are Freetown.
We are Freetown!
The golden rules of Freetown.
Don't pretend you're something that you're not.
Don't go thinking you're better than anyone else,
or that anyone else is better than you.
Don't shout about it. Get on with it.
We are Freetown.
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 Yeah.
We found our voice again.
I'm from India and Freetown.
I'm from China and Freetown.
I'm from the UK and Freetown.
I am from Nigeria and Freetown.
I am from home and Freetown.
This city belongs to everyone.
The fisherman,
the taxi driver,
the barber,
the drummers, the dancers.
All of us.
All of us. Everybody. We are Freetown.
The past is ours.
The future is ours. It's our time again.
And this city belongs to everyone.
The playwright,
the greengrocer,
the teacher,
the dog.
This space is ours.
This light is ours.
The beaches are ours.
The rivers now we own.
The roads are ours.
The bridges now we own.
We are Freetown.
We are all visitors and we've all been here forever.
We've got the mightiest river.
And the biggest sky.
And there's a resonance again.
Freetown. Freetown.
We are proud of this place.
We love this city.
And we want you to love it too.
We are proud of this place.
Na pass we all dey pass like stranger dem, but we all don't dare from them. Come here, and you'll feel it, that end of the line sense of freedom. Say yes to Freetown. Say yes to freedom.
As I mentioned before, my research highlights the interconnectedness and relationships between the micro and the macro levels of cultural production, between the local and the global, and between aesthetics, politics, policy, governance structures, institutions, and history. I would like to focus first on the micro level, so on the impact of local and global flows on the aesthetics of theatre in Sierra Leone. I show throughout my book that cultural productions, such as theatre, respond to macrocosmic processes through microcosmic transformation and translation, so embedding their development in a very specific local, historical, cultural, social, political, and economic context. And the notion of the hybridity of the local and the global is crucial for this research, as it underpins the argument that artistic production happens in a continuum of cultural flows, transformation, and translation across localities, regions, and national borders. And many Sierra Leonean artists draw on both, transforming and translating global forms into something that is meaningful for the local while still maintaining global traces. And these strategies of so-called globalisation, so focusing on the local translation, reinterpretation, and adaptation, can be identified, for example, in the way plays are created and performed, or the type of stories that are told. And global flows that seem most pertinent and influential in Sierra Leone come from other Anglophone countries in West Africa, in particular Nigeria, Ghana, and the Gambia. And this is reinforced not only by linguistic commonalities and regional affinities, but also by closer cultural, historical, political, and economic links. Within these dynamics, new digital media and technologies obviously also play a significant but also contradictory role. And the impact of this continuum of local and global flows, but also of the general political economy in Sierra Leone on the aesthetics of contemporary queer theatre is multifaceted and anchored at many different levels. But I'd like to give a few examples just to illustrate this point. So, for example, the focus on developmental theatre favors improvisation over well-polished scripts. The limited facilities in terms of stages, lighting, and sound systems force playwrights to creatively adapt to what is available to them. So, for example, by building the story around one setting or using a storyteller to guide the mise en scène, playwrights also employ techniques of stylization, transposition, adaptation, and reinterpretation to introduce autochthonous material, and they sterilize, inverted commas, indigenous and traditional stories and performances for international audiences to suit their specific level of understanding and taste. The development industry occupies a complicated and dualist role in this context. By both circumscribing and endorsing theatre through the power of its funding, the development industry does not only affect aesthetics in a narrower sense, such as stories, images, and forms, but also in a wider sense, such as the relationships of theatre, including perceptions of its role, functionality, and who it is for. But the development industry does not only impact the contemporary development of Sierra Leonean theatre in terms of its aesthetics, but also in terms of policy, structural, and institutional levels. For example, by focusing on strengthening the post-conflict state and on developing the country through directing government priorities and budgets towards policy areas such as health, education, infrastructure, legal institutions, and natural resource management. And so all of this then also affects the perception of the general value, or you could also say non-value, of culture and its importance for development. All of which in turn then also influences both the micro level and the macro level of cultural production. But I would like to highlight still that despite this current focus on developmental theatre in Sierra Leone, there are also a number of efforts to move beyond this circumscription of theatre and the narrow scope of developmental theatre. And so there are efforts both by theatre practitioners and philanthropists who fight, for example, for the development of a more independent, diverse, and less instrumentalized cultural and creative sector as a whole. There are also occasional non-developmental theatre performances in Freetown, for example, at festivals or conferences, performances by university groups, and also some storytelling theatre. I'm now moving on to the macro level. So for the remainder of this presentation, I will talk about the wider ecology of theatre and the cultural and creative industries more broadly in Sierra Leone. And I've split this in three aspects. Firstly, policy and legislation. Secondly, structural and institutional context. And thirdly, international cultural organizations and relations. Analyzing the impact of the continuum of local and global flows on the macro level also requires an understanding of the historical, cultural, social, political, and economic factors and agents that have shaped and continue to shape relevant policies, structures, and institutions. And in Sierra Leone, these factors include the context of a state classified by the international community until recently as post-conflict, the ongoing development of the Sierra Leonean state, its institutions and structures, the country's general socioeconomic status, and the relatively low average buying power of local audiences, which makes theatre depend on local elites, development agencies, and in particular international NGOs and international cultural organizations. But to analyze the impact of the local and global flows, it was also really important for my research to understand the wider historical context and legacy of colonialism. When summarizing the policy and legislative context for Sierra Leonean theatre and the cultural and creative industries more broadly, it is important to highlight that the Sierra Leonean constitution commits to preserving, protecting, and promoting the country's culture and to provide funds for the development of culture. Sierra Leone also has a national cultural policy that was ratified in 2013, and some legislation relevant to the cultural and creative industries, such as a Copyright Act, which was enacted in 2011, and the Monuments and Relics Act, which was last updated in 1967. But experts and practitioners argue that the current legislation is not sufficient for meeting sector needs and not adequate enough for responding to changing local and global circumstances. Also, there is a major gap between the celebration of the culture and creative industries in Sierra Leone, for example, as a driver of development, and the levels of support and investment that are actually reaching the sector. And the fact that the national cultural policy and existing legislation have still not been fully implemented makes the existing legislation and the positive changes they seek to enforce largely ineffective. Unfortunately, it will go beyond my time today to discuss all the factors that have impacted and continue to impact the policy and legislative context for the cultural and creative industries in Sierra Leone, but I would like to highlight a couple of points that I find particularly interesting. In Sierra Leone, the influence of the global discourse on culture and development and the creative industries is clearly visible in the concepts, language, and strategies employed in the national cultural policy for Sierra Leone, and more generally by the Ministry of Tourism and Cultural Affairs and its officials. But at the same time, there are also contradictions and tensions between the global discourse and its actual application in Sierra Leone. And so global discursive flows encounter local frictions, which shape the translation of this discourse into local practice and complicate simple models of power structures. And in this context, it's also really important to remember that a direct replication of policies without acknowledging diverse and locally specific cultural, social, political, and economic realities has proven to be problematic and often ineffective. And so it's really important to remember that a full and nuanced understanding of and building upon the local context is much more important than following global best practice examples for the development of the cultural and creative industries. The second example I'd like to give is linked to colonial legislative legacies. As a result of colonialism, Sierra Leone's legal system is based on the British system, and upon independence from the United Kingdom, the existing laws of the colony and the background laws of the UK, which includes any international agreements signed by the UK whilst Sierra Leone was still a colony, continued to apply as long as these laws were not modified or replaced by new laws written and enacted in Sierra Leone. So this means, for example, that until the enactment of the Copyright Act in 2011 and other recent IP laws, Sierra Leone's IP legislation was still linked to British legislation. And so this so-called dependent system determined that, for example, a patent or a copyright with effect in Sierra Leone was obtainable only by having an invention protected in the UK first, and then having the effect of that patent extended to Sierra Leone. And this is obviously hugely problematic. I'm now moving on to the structural and institutional context for cultural production in Sierra Leone. The hybrid governance system established in Sierra Leone by colonial rule worked through both chiefs and the modern state, and this continued into the post-colony. And this hybridization and the tensions inscribed in it are also reflected and played out in the general conception of culture in Sierra Leone, as well as in the governance structures and institutions that shape and regulate the cultural landscape, which also include traditional institutions such as chiefs, for example. In Sierra Leone, public support for the CCIs is almost non-existent, apart from a handful of publicly funded national institutions, and only a small proportion of cultural activities are currently supported by private and business sponsors or by NGOs and development agencies. So there is very limited access to finance. Another challenge relates to the country's relatively low buying power and the fact that arts and cultural creative products are still often considered a luxury. And this applies especially to the more resource-intensive events and art forms, such as theatre, where production costs and therefore ticket prices can be very high. And as a result of this underinvestment in the CCIs, the long-standing centralization of public cultural funding and limited access to private funding or sponsorship, the CCIs remain informal and fragmented outside the core national state-sponsored institutions. So the wider ecology of culture in Sierra Leone lacks crucial elements and structures, which is, however, also tied to factors outside the ecology of culture, such as generally limited infrastructure, educational opportunities, and access to finance, as well as a challenging business and legislative environment and a relatively low buying power of potential audiences. And so this overall weak enabling environment makes it difficult on a macro level to enhance and grow the creative economy, and on a micro level for many individuals to translate their creative skills into a livelihood. As a result of these limited education opportunities and financing mechanisms for the CCIs, international relations and organizations, such as UNESCO, development agencies, and international NGOs, play a disproportionately significant role in the current cultural ecology in Sierra Leone, as they offer sought-after funding, partnerships, technical assistance, capacity building, collaboration, and exposure. And so this gives these organizations significant political, economic, and social capital, for example, to promote normative global discourses, such as the current creative economy discourse, and to frame the development of the CCIs in a certain institutionalized way, often inspired by so-called best practice examples from the global north. The African Union and the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, currently do not play an active role in the Sierra Leonean cultural ecology, and none of the African Union's or ECOWAS treaties and plans of action in relation to culture are mentioned in the national cultural policy for Sierra Leone, or seem to have influenced its development or the discourse and culture in Sierra Leone more generally. But there have been recent regional integration efforts at ECOWAS level, which, for example, led to the adoption of a regional cultural policy across West Africa. And this and the relatively new African continental free trade area may add other facets to the dynamics across the CCIs in Sierra Leone. So it will be really interesting to track if and how these regional integration efforts will impact both cultural policy and practice in Sierra Leone in the years to come. We have now come to the end of my presentation, and I hope that I was able to give you some interesting insights into the political economy of contemporary Sierra Leonean theatre and the ecology of the cultural and creative industries more broadly in Sierra Leone. As I mentioned earlier, my research particularly highlights the impact of the international development industry, international cultural organizations, and international cultural relations on approaches to cultural production and cultural policymaking in Sierra Leone. And it links to particular findings from my research to larger issues of contemporary local cultural production within the context of globalization, commodification, the so-called global creative economy, culture and sustainable development, international relations, and decolonisation. And you can read more about all this in my book that is titled Globalisation, Commodification, and Cultural Production in Africa, Contemporary Theatre in Sierra Leone. And in this book, I also do not assume that there is a magic formula to fix the challenges that contemporary theatre in Sierra Leone is facing. But the book points towards ways of thinking, approaches to policy, and specific points of action beyond superficial so-called best practice snippets and simplified success stories. And these ways of thinking and approaches to policy and specific points of action can lead towards more independent and diverse cultural and creative sectors while being sensitive to local complexities. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.